For more than 100 years, the oak saplings on this Cornish hillside never had a chance. Just ancient oaks, some over 500 years old, slowly aging without successors, while sheep grazed every seedling to the bone. Then one family made a single decision. They took the sheep off the land, no planting, no seeding, no soil work. Within a few years, the slope erupted into something that looked impossible for England. A tangled, dripping forest of moss-draped oaks, ferns climbing every branch, and lichens unlike anything found in mainland Europe. Across the boundary, the neighboring fields stayed exactly as they were. Short grass, no trees, no recovery. Scientists from 3 universities arrived to document what was happening at Cabilla. What they found was not just a comeback. It was the return of a habitat most British people do not even know exists. Britain has rainforest, real rainforest. And the only reason most of it has vanished is not climate, it is not soil, it is not logging. It is something else entirely. To understand what came back when those sheep left, you first have to see what Britain quietly lost. 12,000 years ago, as the last ice age released its grip on the British Isles, a strange and humid forest pushed in from the Atlantic. Carried on warm, wet winds funneled across the ocean by the Gulf Stream, this forest was not like the dry oak woods of Central Europe. It dripped year-round with rainfall and sea fog. Sessile oaks rooted into rocky slopes, joined by hazel, holly, rowan, and downy birch. Across the western fringe of Britain and Ireland, from Cornwall up through Devon, Wales, the Lake District, and into the Scottish Highlands, a single ribbon of temperate rainforest spread along every valley and coastline, kissed by the wet maritime air. This was Britain's Atlantic rainforest, one of the rarest habitats on the planet. It belongs to a global biome covering less than 1% of the world's land surface. Yet at its peak, it may have blanketed up to 1/5 of the British landscape, a green cathedral of moss, water, and stone. What grew here defied imagination for those who had never seen it. A single oak branch in a temperate rainforest can carry more than 200 species of moss, lichen, and liverwort. Ferns sprouted from fissures in the bark. Filmy ferns, only a single cell thick, glowed translucent in the perpetual damp. Lungwort lichens, which only survive in clean, ancient woodland air, hung from limbs in great leafy curtains. Bryophytes carpeted every surface, boulders, fallen trunks, the very ground itself, turning entire glens into a soft, breathing sponge. Below the canopy, streams ran cold and clear, fed by mist condensing in the leaves above. Pied flycatchers darted through the undergrowth. Wood warblers sang from the high branches. Otters slipped along the rivers, and dormice nested in the hazel. The forest was not a museum piece. It was a working machine, soaking up rainfall, filtering water, locking carbon into deep humus, and keeping the western hills cool through the long summers. For thousands of years it persisted, growing, dying, regenerating in cycles older than any civilization on the island. Even early human communities lived alongside it, hunting and gathering at its margins. To know this forest stood here once is to understand that Cornwall, Devon, and Wales were never naturally bare. They were once the wettest, mossiest woodlands in Europe. The Atlantic rainforest didn't fall to climate change or natural collapse. It fell to people slowly over thousands of years. The first heavy clearance began in the Bronze Age, when farmers cut woods to graze livestock on the milder slopes. By the medieval period, much of southwest England had already been stripped for fuel, timber, and tin smelting. The Industrial Revolution accelerated the loss, with what little remained reduced to charcoal for Cornish copper and tin furnaces. By the 20th century, less than 1% of Britain's land surface still carried temperate rainforest. The rest had been converted into something else entirely, open sheep pasture, often called moorland, but ecologically a ghost of what came before. Today, sheep are the single greatest barrier to the rainforest's return. Across the western British uplands, more than 15 million sheep graze year-round, with densities in some areas exceeding 2 animals per hectare. Unlike the deer of Scotland, sheep are kept on the land deliberately, supported for centuries by farming traditions and government subsidies that pay landowners by the head. Wherever sheep are present, oak seedlings, hazel shoots, and holly saplings are nipped off within days of germinating. The forest cannot return for the same reason it has not returned in 2,000 years. Every young tree is eaten before it can grow taller than the grass. The damage extends far beyond the trees. Ground flora collapses under constant grazing. Bilberry, heather, and the rare oceanic mosses that need shade and moisture vanish from open slopes. Soils become compacted under hooves, losing the organic layer that once held rainfall like a sponge. Without canopy cover, the western hillsides shed water in violent flash floods, scouring valleys and silting rivers. Lichens that depend on humid, sheltered air retreat to a handful of remnant trees. Bird species that once filled these woods, pied flycatcher, wood warbler, and redstart, cling to fragments while the open slopes around them stand silent. The challenge isn't just biological, it's economic and political. Many upland farms operate on slim margins held together by subsidy, with sheep grazing as the only viable use of the land under existing rules. Reducing flock numbers means a complete rethinking of what hill country is for, and that conversation has barely begun. Successive governments set woodland targets, but on the ground, the western uplands remain locked in ecological stasis. The trees still standing are old. The ones that should be replacing them are eaten. The forest is held in suspension, not by an absence of seed, but by an unyielding pressure from above. By the early 2020s, frustration with the slow decline had reached a tipping point. A handful of landowners, scientists, and writers began asking a different question. Not how to plant a forest, but what would happen if the grazing simply stopped. Across the wet western fringe of Britain, the surviving fragments of temperate rainforest cling to land too steep, too rocky, or too inconvenient to clear. Recent mapping by University of Plymouth researchers and the lost rainforests of Britain project shows that fewer than 18,000 hectares remain in England, less than 1% of the country's surface, scattered into hundreds of disconnected pockets. In Cornwall and Devon, the largest survivors hide in deep river gorges and on the sheltered flanks of granite tors. Wistman's Wood on Dartmoor, with its twisted, moss-cloaked oaks, is perhaps the most famous. At Cabilla on Bodmin Moor, more than 100 acres of ancient woodland still trace the curve of the river Badalda, some of its oaks more than 500 years old. These remnants are not forests in the modern sense. They are islands of memory, surrounded by sheep pasture and bracken. The trees that remain are mostly mature or aging, their crowns thinned by storms, their understories nearly empty of young trees. Walk into one, and the air changes immediately. The temperature drops, the sound of wind dies. Every surface, rock, root, bark, branch is upholstered in green. Some of these woodlands hold lichens found nowhere else on Earth, including species so rare they have only been recorded in a handful of sites globally. Botanists describe certain Cornish glens as the most species-rich square meters in temperate Europe. Yet they are vanishing in slow motion. Without seedlings rising to replace the old trees, every storm-felled oak is a wound that will not heal. Air pollution from distant agriculture and industry weakens the most sensitive lichens. Invasive rhododendron creeps through unmanaged fragments, smothering the understory. Climate change, paradoxically, threatens the very humidity that defines these places, with hotter summers drying out the bryophyte carpets that took centuries to form. For ecologists, the urgency is sharpened by how few people even know these forests exist. Britain's identity is tied to neat fields and open moors, not to mossy, dripping, jungle-like woods. To lose a habitat the public never knew it had is a quiet tragedy. The question for the scientists watching the last fragments fade was no longer whether the rainforest could return. It was whether anyone would let it. At Cabilla Manor, deep in the heart of Bodmin Moor, the Hanbury-Tenison family had farmed the land for generations. Sheep had grazed the slopes for as long as anyone could remember, eating back any oak or hazel that tried to take root beyond the boundary of the ancient woodland. By the early 2020s, Merlin Hanbury-Tenison and his family made a decision that would have seemed impossible a generation earlier. They pulled the sheep off the upper hillsides. No planting schemes, no soil treatments, just the removal of a single pressure that had defined the land for centuries. What happened next stunned the scientists who arrived to monitor it. Researchers from the University of Plymouth, the University of Exeter, and the Eden Project established long-term plots, mapping every emerging seedling, every patch of moss, every returning lichen. The data was immediate and dramatic. A study published in 2025 comparing oak regeneration at Cabilla and Wistman's Wood found that, where grazing had been removed, sessile oak seedlings appeared in densities that had not been recorded on these slopes in living memory. Within a few growing seasons, young oaks, hazels, hollies, and rowans pushed through the bracken in thousands. The understory responded just as fast. Hard fern, bilberry, and rare oceanic mosses recolonized open ground. Lichen specialists documented the slow return of canopy species drifting in from the older woodland nearby. Insects followed. Soil samples showed measurable increases in invertebrate diversity within 2 years of grazing removal. Bird surveys recorded species that had been absent or rare on the property. Pied flycatchers nested in the new edge habitat, and redstarts fed among the regenerating oaks. The transformation was not subtle. It was a wholesale return of a forest community that had been held offstage for centuries. The ecologists were careful with their conclusions. Cabilla was not a pure experiment. The estate had retained an ancient woodland core, a seed source already in place. But this was precisely the point. The rainforest had not vanished from the land. It had retreated to the few protected spots and waited. Once browsing stopped, the woodland edge began to advance, slowly at first, then faster, climbing the slope in a wave of moss-bound green. Photographs taken from the same fixed points year after year tell the story without commentary. In one frame, a slope of cropped grass and a few scattered rocks. 3 years later, a knee-high tangle of seedlings. 5 years later, a young woodland forming above head height. For the first time in centuries, the slopes of Bodmin Moor were rebuilding their own rainforest, and no one had planted a single tree. Beneath the surface of the returning forest, an older system was quietly stirring back to life. The roots of every emerging oak and hazel quickly tapped into networks of mycorrhizal fungi already present in the soil, the same fungal threads that had connected the surviving ancient trees for centuries. These fungi, invisible to the casual eye, weave through the leaf litter and humus, exchanging nutrients with tree roots and linking individual saplings into a single underground web. Researchers at Cabilla, working with Plymouth and Exeter, documented a sharp rise in mycorrhizal diversity in newly recolonized soil within just a few years of sheep removal. Where browsing had once kept the soil compacted and impoverished, the regenerating canopy began rebuilding the organic layers that fungi need to thrive. This invisible network is what allows rainforest restoration to happen so quickly once grazing stops. New seedlings do not have to fight their way up alone. They plug into a fungal grid maintained by the older trees, drawing water, phosphorus, and nitrogen through fungal pipelines that can stretch hundreds of feet. Studies elsewhere in temperate rainforests have shown that seedling survival rates can more than double when established mycorrhizal networks are intact. At Cabilla, the existing ancient woodland acted as a living reservoir, pumping fungal connections outward into the regenerating slope. But the system has limits. Mycorrhizal networks need continuity. Where land has been grazed bare for so long that no woodland survives nearby, the fungal networks themselves can collapse and recovery slows dramatically. The lesson from Cabilla is that fragments matter. Every surviving patch of ancient rainforest, however small, is also a fungal seed bank, holding the underground architecture that lets the visible forest return. Lose those last fragments, and even removing sheep would not be enough. The forest's resilience is real, but it depends on what is left in the soil. Cabilla worked because the underground rainforest had never died. The above-ground rainforest was just waiting for the pressure to lift. Cabilla is a single estate of around 300 acres. The question shaping British conservation now is whether the same approach can work across an entire region. In November 2023, the British government published its first-ever national strategy for temperate rainforest, formally recognizing the habitat's international importance and committing to its protection and restoration. The plan acknowledges that England alone may have lost more than 90% of its rainforest, and that what remains is highly fragmented, mostly in the southwest, the Lake District, and along the Welsh border. Government targets aim to protect every surviving fragment and create new corridors of rainforest across the western uplands over the coming decades. Behind the government plan, a coalition of conservation organizations is moving faster. The wildlife trusts, in partnership with the insurance company Aviva, launched a £38 million program to restore temperate rainforest at scale across the southwest, Wales, and Cumbria. The model is explicitly drawn from Cabilla and similar projects. It calls for removing grazing, retaining seed sources, letting the forest return on its own where possible, and replanting only where the habitat has been completely erased. The University of Plymouth-led Southwest Rainforest Alliance estimates that nearly 40% of the southwest of England has the climate to support temperate rainforest. The bottleneck is not climate, soil, or seed. It is land use. Independent mapping by the Lost Rainforests of Britain campaign, led by writer Guy Shrubsole, suggests that, given the right conditions, Britain could one day support up to 1/5 of its land surface as rainforest, a habitat covering thousands of square miles from Cornwall to the Western Highlands. The carbon implications are significant. Mature temperate rainforest stores more carbon per acre than almost any other British habitat, locking it into deep humus, mossy soils, and slow-decaying timber. Models published by conservation researchers suggest that large-scale rainforest restoration in the southwest alone could sequester millions of tons of carbon dioxide over the coming decades, while restoring water retention, reducing flash flooding downstream, and bringing back biodiversity at every level. The parallels with the Scottish forest recovery are striking. In both cases, the limiting factor is grazing pressure. In both cases, the land's ecological memory is intact. In both cases, removing the pressure unlocks a recovery that cannot be matched by planting alone. What Cabilla shows in microcosm is what an entire Western Britain might look like if the sheep numbers fell to a level where seedlings could survive. The challenge is no longer scientific. It is a question of agricultural policy, public understanding, and political will. The forests are ready to return. The mycorrhizae are waiting. The seeds are still in the soil. What remains uncertain is whether Britain is ready to let them grow. Today, the line between barren upland and dripping rainforest runs not through soil or weather, but through a single decision: who is allowed to graze and where. No planting required, no soil tricks, no climate engineering. Just the lifting of one pressure, and a forest 500 years in the making begins to rebuild itself. The temperate rainforest of Britain still carries its full memory, ready to awaken. What returns when we simply step aside? Let me know what you think below.